Aloha, everyone, and welcome to Hana Kakou. That means let's work together. We are a weekly program on the Think Tech Hawaii Broadcast Network, and we're broadcasting from beautiful Hawaii. I don't know where you are. If you're in Hawaii, you're enjoying some wonderful sunny weather, but you might be somewhere across the world. And if you are, come to Hawaii and help build our economy. You're going to enjoy today's program. We call it From Pyongyang to D.C. That's right, Pyongyang, North Korea to Washington, D.C. Do these places have anything in common? Well, we hope that the less they have in common, perhaps the better. But they do have a common humanity, and we are all part of that. Today, I'm going to be with a couple of friends of mine. You already may know Malia Blomhill, who happens to be Policy Director for the Grassroot Institute of Hawaii. I'm Keli'i Akina, President of Grassroot, and we're here in Hawaii, but we focus on issues not only for the better economy and government of our state of Hawaii, but also for the entire Pacific Rim and Asia. And today, we have a very special guest. Malia is in Washington, D.C., but so is Doug Bandow. Doug Bandow happens to be a senior fellow at the Cato Institute, which is, in a sense, we like to think of them as a big brother, not big brother in the government sense, but a big brother to us as a think tank. They're everything we are, but tens of millions of dollars more of it. They're very successful as a think tank and focus on issues, at least in Doug's case, that deal with global situations in Southeast Asia in particular, as well as the federal budget here in the United States. Doug is a well-known writer. You may have read his work in the Wall Street Journal, in Washington Times, in other national avenues as well. He was a special assistant to President Ronald Reagan, and we're delighted that we have him today as a fellow scholar of the Grassroot Institute. In fact, today we welcome you to the Grassroot Institute, Doug, and we welcome your expertise, which comes with all of that. So, Doug and Malia, welcome to Hana Kakou. Aloha to you.
And to you as well.
Doug, just want to see if I've covered your illustrious resume correctly. Is there anything else you might add? You're there in cold D.C. right now. Anything else you want to tell our viewers who are really across the world?
No, I mean, it is a little chilly here. I'd prefer to be in Hawaii, but this is kind of the center of policy making in America, so that tends to be where I hang out.
Well, in fact, on that note, those viewers who are interested, we're planning to bring Doug out here in a few months, and so get on our mailing list, go to our website, www.grassrootinstitute, that's singular, grassrootinstitute.org. Malia, switching to you. Aloha. Are you enjoying the winter up there? You're really a local girl, so that'll be an interesting answer you give to the question.
Yes, not at all. Thank you.
Not at all. What do you do to keep warm on those cold nights in Washington, D.C.?
I pay very, very high heating bills.
There you go. Heating bills. Probably high because of the Jones Act, wouldn't you say, as well? It affects the nation. But we're not going to steal the thunder from this show by talking about the Jones Act, although you've written a wonderful article that was published in the Capital Research Center Journal, and so I commend you for that. But going to Doug. Doug, we have been talking about Southeast Asia for several weeks on our program because of its relevance to the Pacific Basin and to Hawaii. At Grassroot Institute, we're very concerned about building an economic bridge between Hawaii and Asia, as well as a cultural educational bridge. But you've spent a good deal of time in China and have also been in North Korea. Any thoughts just off the top as to why these regions are relevant to us?
Well, China obviously has extraordinary economic growth and trade with the United States, but much of the rest of the region is also growing. I mean, South Korea, Japan, Taiwan have been kind of economic tigers for quite some time, and that's spreading to Southeast Asia. You know, a country like Indonesia has a lot of internal problems, but it's a productive place. Vietnam has been liberalizing economically. Even the Philippines has at least had a bit more success on economics. So there's a lot of economic potential there. So all of those places matter economically, but they're very complex politically. China is asserting itself. North Korea is constantly causing trouble. You know, the other countries in the region want good relations with China, you know, but they also don't want to be overcome by
Sure.
China. So there's a lot going on there that matters for the United States economically and strategically.
Now, your organization, the Cato Institute, as well as the Grassroot Institute, is very deeply concerned about the spread of freedom and liberty across the world. What would you say the temperature for liberty is in Southeast Asia, and particularly in China at this time?
Well, China is a very complex place. I mean, the people I deal with, especially students, I think generally want kind of a more liberal society, but they also tend to be rather nationalistic. So it's a complex picture that they I think would like to probably have a more democratic society, but that doesn't necessarily mean it wouldn't also be an assertive society. Elsewhere, countries like South Korea and Japan are vibrant democracies. You see in Southeast Asia, countries like Indonesia have moved from authoritarianism to democracy with some challenges along the way. So again, countries are moving at different speeds. Generally, I think these people want freedom. They've seen the benefits economically. They want more of that in their lives. But dealing with China in particular, this is an ancient civilization. It's an authoritarian government. Yes. It's got its own political issues with that government. So where it's going, it's hard to predict.
One of the things I've seen recently, and perhaps you might concur with this, is a broadening discourse within China. You mentioned that China is many things. It's not just monolithic. And in that broadening discourse, it seems that a good number of people in China are comparing themselves to, or comparing their country to North Korea and saying, well, we're not that bad. In fact, recently, a colleague of mine at a Chinese university, just this weekend, we were talking, and I told him that you're going to be on the program and what we're talking about. And he said, well, North Korea, they're going through what we went through in the Cultural Revolution. And he said that with a certain proud differentiation from North Korea. What do you think about that?
Well, there is. It's interesting. You see a lot more distaste, I think, for North Korea now. It's certainly out in academia. It's on, among bloggers. It's out there in the kind of their Twitter and whatnot. You see a lot of irritation with the way North Korea behaves, its irresponsibility. And you even see some of that seeping into government policy. So I think there's an element of that.
So North Korea is the bad boy for East Asia as well as the world at this time.
Yeah, that's right. They have historic ties there going back to the Korean War, but that doesn't stop the fact that they recognize North Korea is quite backward. Even though their government doesn't care a lot about human rights, North Korea is a lot worse. So I think Chinese look at that with some distaste and recognize there's a gulf there and really want to be on the right side of that gulf.
Sure. When you and I were in China recently, I was very interested in the news, and there were two kinds of headlines that were most intriguing. One set of headlines in China Daily News was how China is now the guardian of safety in the world, with the safety zones as they call them in Chinese, between Japan and China. So that was the Chinese take on that. But the other headlines, you and I were discussing a little bit earlier, something took place in North Korea that kind of sent shudders throughout the world in terms of the way they handle political dissidents. You want to tell our viewers a little bit about that and how you analyze what took place with the vice president of North Korea?
Well, we're in the kind of the 2 years out from the death of Kim Jong-il, the so-called dear leader, and his son, who I like to call the cute leader. I mean, we think he's about 30. So it's kind of 2 years into, at least nominally, being the new great or dear leader. And he recently executed his uncle, who was thought to be kind of the number two guy in the regime. I mean, this guy had been active in the regime for 40 years under both the grandfather and the father. And, it was really very stunning. I mean, family members have been purged before. People have been executed before, but never have they publicly executed a family member, especially somebody like this.
What can we read into this?
Well, the fact they moved so quickly suggests insecurity, that there had to be some kind of a political challenge, and we don't know exactly what it was. It could very well have been factional fighting underneath, Kim Jong-un, the theoretical leader. I mean, there's a concern that maybe the military is reasserting itself. No one quite knows for sure. I mean, this is like Kremlinology. You look at the photos and you see who's standing next to whom, and you see who's on the committee, who's shown in the pictures, who's being airbrushed out. And all the reports are that this fellow Zhang, I mean, he was executed. He's now disappearing from old photos. And family members are being rounded up, sent off to labor camps. Something very serious has gone on. And the regime, for the last 2 years has been fairly irresponsible, even compared to the last previous years. So lots of folks are worried, is there instability? Could there be military provocations coming? None of which we know, and these concerns spread to China. When I was there, the events had just happened, and all they could do is speculate. And they were very concerned what it meant for them, because this guy, Zhang, was kind of the way between North Korea and them. He was the go-between. He was the guy they knew. Now he's gone, and they feel under attack.
When it comes to global standards for the way governments operate and so forth, would you say that the ability for China to look at North Korea and say that they have done this bad thing helps to shape a Chinese national sense that they are different and that their standard is going to be something that has evolved far away from the Cultural Revolution and the kind of political machinations that took place there?
Well, I think the critical thing is for them to actually act on that sentiment. I mean, that sentiment's widespread in academia, among students, among others, but as long as the government doesn't act on it, it doesn't separate them very much. And I think this is part of the internal Chinese debate, and it's something the government has to deal with. There's a lot of folks there, I think, who don't like the North Koreans, but they remain wedded to that alliance relationship, in part in response to us. As long as they're stuck with the relationship, for example, they send defectors back.
Sure.
Defectors who are often killed. I mean, as long as they do that, they are complicit in the regime. So it's kind of hard to separate themselves from North Korea.
Would you say that China's discomfort with North Korea and its behavior is a stabilizing factor in the region by enlisting China's own participation in some of the goals of our allied nations?
Yeah, I think it gives us better opportunity to work with them, though we have to figure out how to really enlist them, and just telling them what we think they should do won't help much. We have to be able to convince them, address their interests, their concerns. We haven't done that very well, but I think it offers hope, because they are not really in sync with North Korea. We have to help move them. We have to address their concerns to do so.
I want to give Malia an opportunity to ask you anything particularly about China or North Korea or the East Asian region. I know she and I have had quite a bit of discussion about the relevance of this region to Hawaii and a role that Hawaii might be able to play. Malia, any thoughts or questions for Doug?
Well, you mentioned, there's this tension then between this sort of historical link to North Korea and then a sort of point of comparison. And that does make me wonder, it's on the one hand, it lets you see how far you've come, but on the other hand, it gives you a reason not to go further. It's can it be almost an excuse, so to speak? If you were, say, looking at our race relations and going, well, at least we're not as bad as South Africa kind of situation. Is it really, does it spur change, or does it, sort of ossify, well, we're here and we don't need to be better because there's somebody worse at our doorstep? That's such a good example to the world of bad.
Well, I think to some degree it spurs it, but there's a limit to that. And I mean, I don't want to suggest the moral equivalence, but we spent a long time allied with the military dictatorship in South Korea. And what we could say was, correctly, that Park Chung-hee is a lot better than Kim Il-sung, the North Korean dictator. South Korea may be bad, but heck, look at the North Koreans. Our guys aren't as bad as theirs. So that does make it a little easier, I think, for you to say, well, yeah, they aren't very nice, but so what? Nevertheless, we did move past that. I think that China's kind of in the same problem, that they know they're better than the North Koreans. They feel but so it's easier to say, well, we don't have to do a lot there. We're better than them. But there's also mixture of a sense of international leadership. There's pressure in terms of military, the distaste, the desire to want to be an international leader. All of this stuff kind of comes together in a very complex form, and I think they're just dealing with that. One of the interesting things is President Xi had a summit meeting with President Park of South Korea, who happens to be the daughter
Yes.
of the military dictator. But she went to Beijing. They had a summit meeting. President Xi has yet to host Kim Jong-un. So it's a real signal, I think, that they recognize South Korea as an important player, bigger economy, serious country to deal with, and it signals to some degree their distaste with North Korea. That's something I would not have expected 20 years ago. today, I think that fits with an evolving pattern.
Thank you. You've been listening to Doug Bandow, Senior Fellow at the Cato Institute, who is an expert in civil liberties as well as global issues, particularly in the Southeast Asian theater. And we're going to get back, we're going to talk to him again following this break and bring the issues a little bit closer to home as we look at the federal budget and look at the Affordable Care Act, which is upon us right now. I'm Keli'i Akina with the Grassroot Institute. You're watching a Hana Kakou on the Think Tech Hawaii Broadcast Network. We'll be right back after this.
Aloha, I'm Nicole Horry for Think Tech. For nearly half a century, the Hawaii Foreign Trade Zone No. 9 has brought the benefits of the Foreign Trade Zone program to Hawaii businesses and entrepreneurs. DBET, the Department of Business, Economic Development and Tourism, operates Hawaii's Foreign Trade Zone program to encourage international business and economic development. The Foreign Trade Zone's mission is to increase the amount of international trading activity in Hawaii, thereby providing employment opportunities for the residents of our island state. For more information, see ftz9.org. I'm Nicole Horry. Mahalo.
We welcome you back to a Hana Kakou, a weekly program on the Think Tech Hawaii Broadcast Network. And I want to say mahalo to Jay Fidel, producer-in-chief of this broadcast network. And I hope that you'll enjoy this program and many others by going to the thinktechhawaii.com website, and you can watch just a tremendous collection of programs that are dealing with public policy through culture all across the world. We're talking today with Doug Bandow, a senior fellow at the Cato Institute, who also cooperates with us as a scholar at the Grassroot Institute. We're tapping into his expertise on matters Asian as well as American. We call today's program From Pyongyang to D.C. Doug, recently when I was in Beijing, I had an interesting conversation about the special economic zones that China has been developing. And one of the interesting things is that it is a very hot question to ask, how can China distribute the Hong Kong economic miracle throughout China? And that, of course, leads to the fact that free enterprise is somewhat of a virus. Interestingly, as we look at our own country and economic freedom indexes, such as put out by the Heritage Foundation, the United States is slipping in terms of its free market status. And one big move, I think, that's going to affect our standing is the Affordable Care Act recently, whereas many nations that are formerly communist are becoming a little bit more open to free markets. We're, it seems, going the opposite direction. Would you say that's what's taking place with Obamacare?
Well, that's definitely a huge assertion of federal power. I mean, healthcare has long had a very large government component. Government has accounted for almost half of all spending, and then the whole kind of tax component and what it's done to create employer-provided health insurance and a third-party payment system. We have not had a true market system in healthcare, but the Obama legislation is a massive expansion of federal control over who has to provide what benefits are provided, who pays what, massive subsidies. I mean, it really is kind of, I think, an attempt to hook the American people in yet another way on a massive government program.
Certainly. In Hawaii here, we have an interesting case because without Obamacare, our state government had created a public-private partnership with free enterprise so that 92% of all people in our state were effectively covered by medical insurance policies, and the remainder were covered by charity and other safety nets. Now with Obamacare, we have jeopardized that for a good number. Do you see something ominous for the relationship between states' rights and the federal government taking place with Obamacare?
Well, this is one more assertion of power. It's one after another. I mean, what you see here, what's interesting is the federal government has not tried to force states to set up exchanges. If a state doesn't set up an exchange, the federal government does. And that, of course, is where we've seen the biggest problems in terms of the website and everything else.
Yes.
So the federal government recognizes there's a limit to how far it can push its power in that regard. Nevertheless, it's nationalized standards in terms of kind of what has to be in policies. So it really has created a national policy where states that previously were much freer to experiment. The expansion of Medicaid, that's the court kind of limited what the feds could impose there, but that was another attempt to nationalize. So I think it continues a long pattern. It's not, in a sense, new, but rather it's another big step forward of a federal government expanding itself at almost every issue area.
Malia, as our policy director at Grassroot Institute, and I have had many conversations about a concept called federalism, and in particular competitive federalism, and we will be launching a campaign here in Hawaii in the month of March to help bring policymakers into that discussion. Malia, would you explain this notion of federalism, or at least competitive federalism, and how Obamacare may impact this value, which actually is a very tried and true American value?
Well, as Doug no doubt knows, being from Cato and such, it's really the underlying, concept in our Constitution, and it's a huge protector of individual liberties and the centrality of the state, and that's why we put such an emphasis on it. If I could just get back to a point you made earlier, what to me is one of the most interesting things, in a bad way, about Obamacare is the wealth of unintended consequences. So we look at the consequences to state power, federal power, and then there's all the things we don't think about. I know you mentioned in one of your articles the impact on charity, and how it's affecting health charities and mutual benefit societies and such. And I kind of wanted to see what you thought. I mean, when we brought in welfare, and we brought in, even you could say even when you bring in divorce, it came back in the 60s, it had unintended consequences for our economy, for the family, so to speak, and all these things that just kind of fall out. So what are the, we don't know where it will all lead, but what are some of these unintended consequences in terms of federal power and in terms of, individuals just sort of letting things go to the state? That come out of Obamacare, you think?
Well, I think it's interesting. One of the differences between those who generally believe that the government is the end point or the final, a place you go as opposed to the starting point, is that those who are skeptical of government solutions recognize unintended consequences. Folks who want to go to government immediately always imagine the triumph of good intentions. If I simply wave my hands and declare that healthcare will be affordable and free to everybody, it'll happen. Well, most of us recognize, well, no, it just doesn't work that way. We're certainly seeing that in healthcare. I was writing about, a couple of odd examples. There was a New York Times piece about kind of professionals there, many of them kind of in the arts community, but also lawyers and others, in small group plans who suddenly found that their plans are ineligible. That, even if they meet the standards, the government wants them as part of the exchanges because it wants to broaden the pool. That is, they are healthier individuals, so they have to be dragged into the pool and they have to pay more. So all these Obama supporters suddenly found out, they were perfectly happy, they banded together, had good health insurance, but now the government says, no, it doesn't matter what you want. We've got something we need you for. Now it's more expensive and not as good. And then out in California, you have charities that want to help poor people by helping them pay their premiums in an exchange. And the insurance companies are saying, oh, no, we're not supposed to have sick people in the exchange. We're supposed to have healthy people. So you can't let them do this because this ruins the pool. And you look at that and you think, well, this is crazy. We should want to help pay premiums for poor people so they get better health insurance. Now you're telling us that, well, they're poor, so they need to stay in Medicaid. It's very, and these, again, nobody thought about this. It's the spiraling upward of premiums. Some of us warned this likely would happen. Those who were part of it didn't seem to think this would happen. And you see that with this, you set standards on policies. Well, that raises prices, that raises premiums. Well, then how do you afford it? Well, then if more people have to pay for it, then they won't sign up. If they don't sign up, then the rate pool, the insurance, though the pool of those insured gets worse. Premiums go up even more. Then what happens? Everybody wants higher, kind of premium support from the government. You can see this cycle growing, and nobody seemed to take this stuff seriously. It was simply good intentions. This is what we want. And I think that's where, and this happens in lots of government policies. And, these policymakers sit around suddenly saying, well, how'd that happen? I didn't intend that. But that's quite common.
Well, that's a very good response to this issue. And I think a lot of times policymakers as well as citizens are at a loss as to how to think about a government a proposal or a bill or and so forth, such as Obamacare when it was in the formative stage. What we like to do, Doug, and you know this is true at Cato Institute and at the Grassroot Institute, we like to bring a set of criteria to every government measure. We ask three questions. One, what does it do for individual liberty? And I think with Obamacare, we see that we've actually restricted individual choice and liberty. Number two, what does it do in terms of freer markets? Well, again, we have centralized something that the free market was actually competitive at and reduced the competition. And number three, what about limited and accountable government? Does it keep government accountable and limited to its essential functions, or does it expand it unnecessarily? And that's a question I'd like you to address when we come back from a break, because you've also done some serious research on the federal budget, which is really the broader context in which the debate over Obamacare is taking place. And I want to commend you on some recent articles that you have written, and say to our viewers as well that you'll be able to find several articles by Doug Bandow coming out on our Grassroot Institute website, grassrootinstitute.org, as Doug Bandow, Senior Fellow at Cato Institute, has graciously consented to work with the Grassroot Institute as a fellow scholar. We'll be right back with Hana Kakou, our weekly program on public affairs on the Think Tech Hawaii Broadcast Network, right after this short break.
I'm Hong Jiang, host for Asia in Review on Tuesdays.
And I'm David Day, host for Asian Review on Thursdays. Both of us broadcast our respective shows at 4 p.m.
And my topics tend to deal with questions related to environment, culture, history, and sometimes human rights.
And my shows tend to be on international business, foreign policy, geopolitics, and national security. And you can watch our shows live on the Think Tech website at thinktechhawaii.com.
And you can also watch us on YouTube or Olalo.
So come join us on Thursdays at 4 p.m. I'm David Day.
And on Tuesdays at 4 p.m., I'm Hong Jiang.
Aloha.
Aloha.
Welcome back to Hana Kakou. We're here every week, and this week we're naming our program from Pyongyang to D.C., and there are a lot of issues that we can talk about that span the globe. Our expert today is Doug Bandow, a senior fellow with Cato Institute with vast experience in understanding issues ranging from what takes place in China, North Korea, as well as Washington, D.C. You may have seen his writings in journals such as the Wall Street Journal, Washington Times, and other national press. Today, one of the issues we want to talk about is the federal budget. Doug has just done some significant research in analyzing where we are with regard to the federal budget, but if you're like me, it's very difficult to follow exactly what the key issues are in thinking about the federal budget because of much of the politicization that has taken place. And recently, the budget itself was the focal point of a major partisan battle in Congress. Doug, could you just in simple terms explain for all of us what exactly the federal budget is, and what do we need to be concerned about with regard to the federal budget?
Well, the federal budget, the Uncle Sam today spends around $3.6 trillion. And I think the big issue to my mind basically is we're effectively bankrupt. That if you look at the long-term spending trends, they're very bad. The current national debt is about $17 trillion, about 17.2. It's larger than the GDP. It's about so we have a debt of about 100% to GDP, and it's continually growing. The deficit last year for 2013, the fiscal year that's just ended, for the first time in 5 years, dipped below $1 trillion. Even under the best spending scenario in the upcoming years, according to the Congressional Budget Office, it'll drop only for the next 2 years, still to around $400 billion. Then it starts back up. So by 10 years from now, it'll be back up close to $1 trillion. And the CBO tells us under the best set of spending estimates they have, the federal government will add more than $6 trillion in red ink over the next decade. And under a more likely scenario, they call it the alternative, fiscal scenario, it'll be almost $9 trillion in red ink. And that's assuming that Congress doesn't, step back from spending cuts like it just did and doesn't do new programs. There's no new recession. So you look at those numbers; they're bad enough, but it's the future years where entitlement spending really takes off. It's Social Security, Medicare, which are it's demography. It's an aging population, and most of the debate that we've seen over the last, say, 2 or 3 years has been focused on what's called discretionary spending, which is the money the appropriations you control year to year, not entitlement spending, which is the big spending. And everybody wants to try to control things. If let's cut foreign aid, it's fine by me, but foreign aid is $30 billion in a $3.6 trillion budget. It isn't very much. So we have to what we have to grapple with, and the American people haven't, and policymakers won't, is that if you take the 5 biggest programs, it's more than 80% of the budget, and the 5 biggest programs aren't easy to control. It's military, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and interest. And so, if you want to deal with the deficit, you got to deal with them. You could cut everything else, we'd still have a deficit. But nobody wants to deal with those big ones. And I think, to me, that's the real crisis. Those are the things that explode in the future. Those are the things that are the bulk of spending. None of them's easy to deal with. And all anyone in Washington wants to argue about is, well, I don't know, how much are we spending on some little program? We waste a lot of money on dumb things. But even if we eliminated all of that, all of the pork, all of the foreign aid, we'd still have a deficit. We got to deal with the big stuff.
Now, doing the math, as you suggest, we obviously are in a condition that is unsustainable. But what does that really mean? If the federal budget is not able to be sustainable into the near future, and we can't print money fast enough, what actually happens? I think that people were a bit confused during the so-called federal budget shutdown that was the focus of news a few months ago. And I know, by the way, in China, it was really something that confused our colleagues there, because they would ask questions like, have you locked the front door? Can nobody go into the country? And so forth. What are the real immediate and long-term consequences of an unsustainable federal budget?
Well, I encourage people, if they're interested in this issue, read Congressional Budget Office reports. They're dry. There's serious economists who do this stuff. But these folks are smart. They try to present things in a very kind of objective fashion. And they present the kind of the horrid scenarios, so you don't run out of your room screaming, but it kind of gives you a sense in terms of what's upcoming. And the basic point is, at some point it all falls apart. That is, if you have a deficit of $1 trillion, at some point markets don't believe you're going to be able to sustain it. Then suddenly interest rates go from 1% to 3% to 4%, and now you're paying $800 billion a year instead of $200 billion a year on interest. That has to come off the top. And then suddenly, how do you sustain that? And then at some point you risk financial crisis, where markets won't handle your debt, nobody foreign wants to buy it, and then you can't borrow at any affordable price. Then the whole system shuts down. And we've been very lucky because the Europeans have been such a mess. Because everybody looks around the world and says, where shall we park our money? Where do we invest? The U.S. still looks fairly stable and safe. Nobody trusts the Chinese numbers. They're growing, but everybody thinks they're lying about the numbers. Nobody, there's no transparency. It's not Japan. Switzerland isn't big enough. Everybody would love to buy their debt, but there just isn't much. Europe has the euro crisis, so there's America. But someday the Europeans will sort things out. Then there's an alternative. And you can imagine debt shifting there, and people are going to start looking at the U.S. and say, our finances long-term look worse than the Europeans. We're not yet at Greece levels, but Illinois is Greece. California is Greece. We have Greece in our country. It's some of the states. And our risk is, you look at the CBO reports, they play this stuff out, 20, 30 years, is we could be at a, kind of a 200% debt to GDP ratio, by say 2040. Well, the Greece at its worst was about 142%. So, we're heading in the wrong direction. Unsustainable trends can't be sustained. But if you're in that direction and it falls apart, it can be very, very ugly.
It would seem that in the arena of some states, as well as municipalities, whether it's Illinois or Detroit, we're actually finally seeing the real effects that somehow the federal government is able to evade from year to year and push off further into the future. Here in Hawaii, we have a very unsustainable situation as well that has to deal with our unfunded liabilities, as we like to call them. Malia, I think you wanted to chime in on that. Go ahead. We'll go to Malia.
Yeah, the thing is, what we see in Hawaii is it's almost, as anyone who tries to preach fiscal responsibility in government knows, it's frustrating because you start to wonder whether people don't believe you or they just know that it's not going to happen while they're in charge, and that's really all that matters to them. But it's frustrating in that we had Congressman Ryan who from one side, from everything you hear, eats babies for lunch or something because he dares to imagine cutting the budget, and then the actual what actually happens is not even what we'd hoped. And we had the experience with the sequestration and promises of mass hysteria and dogs and cats living together and pure Armageddon, which never obviously materialized. But still, we seem to just be kind of going backwards almost, it seems. And so in a way, my question is, are we just waiting until things get bad enough that no one can ignore it anymore? We pin these hopes on people like Congressman Ryan, who then trades cuts now for cuts in the future, which in the world of politics means no cuts, honestly. So.
That's right. The budget deal says the next 2 years we increase spending, but 10 years from now we'll cut it. Oh, right. Yeah, we've tried that before. Now, I think what's important to recognize is most politicians, I think most of these people aren't stupid, but they have a short-term perspective. I want to get reelected next year, right? I mean, if I talk about devastation and horrible stuff and say I want to cut Medicare, well, I won't get reelected. So forget it. All I care about is that short term. And unfortunately, that suggests that until a crisis hits, nothing gets done. And of course, that's really quite dangerous, and I think that's very worrisome. And I think it's important to recognize that both parties are infected by this. I mean, the performance of the Republican Congress under George W. Bush was awful. Massive spend increases in everything. Rapid rises in discretionary spending in military, everything, education. And pork barrel spending peaked under the Republican Congress, not a Democratic Congress. Nick Eberstadt at AEI has done a great paper looking at entitlement spending, and he pointed particularly to Richard Nixon, to George H.W. Bush, to George W. Bush, and said that entitlement spending grew faster under Republicans than Democratic presidents, and particularly fast under those three guys. So we have this illusion that, well, if you only elect Republicans, they're all wonderful and they'll stop spending. Well, the reality is no. That doesn't mean there aren't some of them who wouldn't, and if Paul Ryan had his way, I suppose he'd probably cut more than he'd prefer to cut some, but the budget deal he came up with was status quo. I mean, it really did give us more spending, to these promises of future cuts that no one believes will exist. I mean, this is horrible, and this is at a time where CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, tells us that coming decade, which they won't deal with, we have at least $6 trillion more in red ink coming, and perhaps $9 trillion, and that assumes that we don't have more budget deals like this that raise spending.
Well, Doug, you've certainly spelled out very clearly what the ominous future may be, because we are simply unsustainable in what we are doing in terms of our federal budget. Let me ask you this. What's the solution? And on two levels. I mean, what would the ideal solution from a freer market frame of reference be, something that we would promote at Cato Institute and Grassroot Institute? And what's a realistic step toward that? What can be done to reverse course?
I think the first step as a society is we have to have an adult conversation. We have to have political leaders who are willing to go to the people and say, look, there is no easy way out of this. Yes, we could slash foreign aid. That's a great idea, but that's 1%. Okay, I take out pork barrel spending. That's 2%. Now let's get on with it. And we have to have that. We have to have that as individuals, and we can't punish politicians who have that conversation with us. We need to have that conversation. If we don't have that conversation, I don't see much solution coming. I think we have to be ruthless in looking at every program. And yes, some of the criteria you gave are very good. I think we should ask, is it constitutional? Is there constitutional warrant for this? Is it necessary in some serious sense of meeting a fundamental need? It's not enough to say, wouldn't it be nice? We're broke. So we can't just spend money on everything because it sounds good. We have to kind of do comparatively. Does it make sense to borrow and burden future generations for expenditure X? We have to ask, what's fair about this? We have a lot of corporate welfare. Why do we subsidize the advertising of profit-making corporations? How does that make any sense at all? So we have to go down program by program, and it's important to say there are no sacred cows. Everybody wants to say, well, cut something, but not this, not that. And I include the military on this. We have to ask what our role is in the world. We account for roughly 40 to 45% of the world's military spending. I would argue most of our military spending today is foreign aid. We're protecting the wealthy Europeans. Well, they're wonderful people. I traveled to Europe and the Czech Republic, Bulgaria this year. I love it. But why shouldn't they pay for their own defense? They have a bigger GDP than us. That we have to ask questions about nation building, about these sorts of things. We can't afford it. The world's different today. The enemies are different. Our allies are different. Everything has to be on the table, and recognize, I think, fundamentally there are moral issues at stake, where you burden the next generation, you borrow, kind of promiscuously and spend promiscuously and dump that burden on future generations. Somebody's going to have to pay this. Hopefully I'll be gone by the time everything blows up. But that means young people today are going to be stuck paying for it, and that hardly seems fair.
Well, that's a start. When we come back from a break, what I'd like to ask you is, what piece would a successful policymaker move forward with, particularly in the 2014 elections? What can voters really get behind? We're not political organizations, Cato Institute or Grassroot Institute, but we do want to give good criteria to people by which they can make educated choices when it comes to the polls. This is Keli'i Akina with the Grassroot Institute. We are interviewing today Doug Bandow, a senior fellow at the Cato Institute, who is an expert on the federal budget as well as Asian issues. We'll be right back after a short break.
Aloha, I'm Jay Fidel for ThinkTech. For nearly half a century, the Hawaiian Foreign Trade Zone, number 9, has brought the benefits of the Foreign Trade Zone program to Hawaii businesses and entrepreneurs. DBED, the Hawaii Department of Business, Economic Development and Tourism, operates Hawaii's Foreign Trade Zone program. It does so to encourage international business and economic development. The Foreign Trade Zone mission is to increase the amount of international trading activity in Hawaii, thereby providing employment opportunities for the residents of our island state. For more information, see ftz9.org. I'm Jay Fidel of ThinkTech. Mahalo.
Well, from Pyongyang to D.C., we've had a wide-ranging conversation here with Doug Bandow, who happens to be a senior fellow at the Cato Institute, well-known in his writings in national media, and someone who really cares about the future and holds values that we share at the Grassroot Institute. I'm Keli'i Akina. I'm going to hand off this conversation in our final segment here to Malia Blomhill, who does an excellent job as our policy director, compiling the research that we put out to help policymakers and citizens to think better about the issues. Malia, you have a question for Doug? Why don't you take it?
Yes. Well, as a non-political organization that deals with political things, you almost automatically become a student of elections, of politics, of how policy is made. And I don't know if this is a theme you've seen, but a theme that I've noticed in the last several elections is really, the conversation being about, what you get as a voter. What do you get from this, decision making? Who does it benefit? It comes out in that red state, blue state conversation. I've heard people say, it doesn't even make sense for this person to be in the Tea Party. If you look at what they get from the Obama administration, it's so much better for them. They come out so much better. And so in that atmosphere where it almost seems like as voters, the message to voters is, well, vote for who's going to give you more stuff. And I think someone very smarter than me once said it's almost impossible to get to people not to vote more things for them with someone else's money. How do you go to them? How do you effectively go to them with what is essentially a message of austerity? This is something we face in Hawaii because we have a giant unfunded liabilities problem. And at some point in time, it's all going to crash down on us, just like the federal budget issue. And we're going to have to go to people and say, you have to give something up. I mean, that's really the only way. But how is that a message? How do we take that? How do we actually make it actionable as a thing? What is the message that we can take to people?
Well, I think it requires kind of this conversation with people that we have to treat them seriously and make the pitch, recognizing we may fail. but I don't see much of an alternative. So the first is that we are citizens, and government should be legislating in a public interest. We can argue exactly what that means, but surely that means is something that's corporately beneficial. That is, government should not be out there to give me money. Government should be out there. It's kind of the other framework of a free society. How do we operate together? How does government help us in ways that we can't do it ourselves? You help poor people because they're poor. You don't help companies because they have influential lobbyists. So we should be able to start making those distinctions. So number one is vote as a citizen, not as somebody going out there trying to steal from everybody else. Then I think the practical aspect of that is you're going to lose at that game, because there's always somebody else out there who has better lobbyists than you. And especially, I think the pitch to make to people of lesser income is, who do you think benefits and runs the system? The notion that we see this with Obamacare. Trust us, everything's going to be wonderful, we're going to give you a great system. Now all these people are finding out they have, the policies are worse, they have to spend more, they don't have the same options. It's, the point is the system will break down at some point. We can, point to other countries where this happens, that, what's best for us as a people. And we also have to, kind of, what do we value? It's not just money, but it's freedom, it's self-respect, it's dignity, it's being agents who can make our own decisions and freely operate with one another. So I think we have to emphasize, and those are, they're tough, but I think Americans can respond to that. Then I think beyond that is making the pitch of, do you want a prosperous society? You want better jobs? How do you think that stuff happens? That if you load all this government stuff on, there is no free lunch. We all want to believe it, but there isn't that. Somebody has to pay. So if somebody comes to you and says, I have a great idea, healthcare will be free, everything will be free, well, you should be skeptical. It's kind of like we talk about, you don't get something for nothing in the investment market, you don't get it in the political market either. It's a hard pitch to make, but we better do it, because if we don't do it, we are going to lose. I think the Republicans have shown this. You try to argue, we can give you a little bit more, a little bit less. They always want to talk about cutting spending, but never specifics. Well, at some point, that just doesn't work.
The only thing I regret, Doug, is that everything you've said, and everything you've said is wonderful, just doesn't fit on a bumper sticker. And unfortunately, in political discourse, if it doesn't fit on a bumper sticker, it doesn't get a lot of traction. But one of the things that I appreciate that you've underscored is the importance of thinking right. And those of us who are at Grassroot Institute and at Cato Institute have not given up. We have hope, don't we, that the American people are people who can think and who have a rich heritage of ideology and philosophy to apply to these issues. But we have to package these ideas in attractive ways. And that's why I'm quite intrigued, especially this Christmas season, with some of your writing, particularly about a Christmas wish list for liberty. Or I love the title of a piece you recently did, Now That I No Longer Believe in World Peace, What I Want from Santa. Would you care to share a little bit of these Christmas wish lists before we close?
Oh, one of my desires was that people stop thinking that Uncle Sam is the same thing as Santa Claus. That, this rich guy or this guy with all the elves will show up and give me everything that I want. It doesn't work that way.
Well, let me just interrupt and then give it right back to you. I think one of the struggles we have in Hawaii is that many of us, because of the significant role the federal government and the military have played in our economy, many of our policymakers really do look to Washington, D.C. as Santa Claus. And the discourse is not about how can we have a more competitive economy that produces what we need. It's often about how can we get more entitlements from Washington, D.C. for education, for our military, for our economy in general. But back to you. I just wanted to comment that what you say is very relevant to our viewers here in Hawaii, but I want to hear the rest of what you have to say.
One of the others, I live in Washington. The political climate is very nasty. It's this red team, blue team thing where everything's personal. So you don't talk about these big issues. The point is Democrats and Republicans should be able to talk about the big issues, and they argue about the specifics. But we've got to be able to, what does it mean to be an American citizen? What does it mean to operate in the public interest, as opposed to how do I insult the other guy and come up with a better attack on him? And I think that American politics has always been rough and ready. You go back to the Adams, Jefferson, battles. It's not as if this was kind of Queensberry rules, but still I worry that what we see today is we've gone beyond. I mean, we don't talk about serious issues anymore. It's just a vicious, I hate him, he's a traitor, he's a this. And that's not helpful for our larger goals. We have to have an adult conversation. That means we all have to sound like adults and act like adults as part of the conversation.
Well, Doug, that's a fitting point at which to close, but the conversation is never closed, and we have to have this adult conversation, and you are certainly contributing to that. I'm very happy that we're able to introduce to our audience here in Hawaii and viewers of Think Tech Hawaii across the world, introduce you as a resource who's going to weigh in on many of the issues we're dealing with in Hawaii, as well as nationally and internationally. But you've already established your forum, and so I commend you very much in your work with Cato Institute as a senior fellow, as a national journalist as well. And Doug, thanks a lot for the insights you've given us today, and I want to wish you a continued happy holiday season, and I hope you get all your wishes from Santa.
So do I, and my best to you all as well.
Well, thank you. And Malia, always adding both intelligence and charm to our programs. Thank you for weighing in today and bringing the insights that you've brought as well as Policy Director for Grassroot Institute.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Well, and again, I thank Jay Fidel, producer, Grand Poobah at large of Think Tech Hawaii Broadcast Network. You're doing a great job. The whole team is doing a great job of putting outstanding content before the public. And so I hope you will go to the thinktechhawaii.com website, take a look at the new features there, take a look at the archive of programs. And until next week, I'm Keli'i Akina with the Grassroot Institute. We'll be back next week on Hana, Kakou. Let's work together for a better government, economy, and society. Aloha.